Great, well, welcome back, everybody. Delighted now to introduce the session, which is a live Q&A with Will Wright. Will really is a man who needs no introduction, but you know me, I'm going to give one anyway. Will really set up the simulation game with SimCity in 1989, and later in 2000 he created The Sims, which is obviously an amazing PC phenomenon. The Sims series having sold over 150 million copies to date. Will founded the development studio Maxis, which he sold to Electronic Arts, and he left EA in 2009 to form the Stupid Fun Club, which was an entertainment think tank. He's now a founder member of a new company called Entertainment, currently in stealth mode, and I'm rather hoping that we'll be able to get some information from him on that. Exclusive stuff. Will has many honors to his name, including being inducted into the Academy of Interactive Arts and the Sciences Hall of Fame, and of course a fellowship from BAFTA. So welcome, Phil. Will. Will. Sorry about that. This is very embarrassing.
You can call me Phil. That's fine.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Right, well, it's a real huge privilege and a pleasure to be able to speak to you. What I'm going to do is ask you a couple of questions and then throw it open to the audience. So the first one is a really, really broad question. It's, would you be able to give us an overview of where you see the games business at this point in time?
I think the games industry has gone through tremendous change, especially in the last 5 years. For the most part, I think it's actually been very, very healthy change. I think that we're hitting a much more diverse audience. We're across a much more, diverse set of platforms. I think we're kind of in this almost Cambrian explosion, of evolution in our industry. And I think that the things we're experimenting with now, some of them are new game genres, but also new business models, new platforms, different forms of kind of synchronous versus asynchronous play. I think all these things are very cool, and it's like this gigantic primordial soup right now of game development. I think the opportunities that game developers have right now are probably wider than they've ever been. I think that you don't necessarily need $10 million, and a large publisher behind you to make a really top title. So I think that the game industry is probably more exciting than it's ever been from my point of view.
So can you tell us then what your plans for Entertainment are and how you plan to exploit these opportunities? What are you going to do next?
Well, in my career, I've always been interested in a couple of core things. One of them really is creativity, giving the players the opportunity to kind of express themselves through gameplay. Give them a very wide open play space where they can kind of make things, they can kind of try different strategies, they can come up with their own goals. Another one is really kind of basing games more in reality. And more, I think that is a way to capture a wider audience, to kind of get things more relevant to people, so that they don't feel like they're just kind of off playing in this disassociated play space, but yet the games they play actually are connecting back to reality and giving them different perspectives on the world in which they live. And I'd say probably the third thing that's always kind of interested me, especially in the latter part of my career, is the idea of community. The idea that these communities are building around these games, and sometimes they're very expressive, creative communities, sharing things that they've created in the game. Other times they're kind of exploring things as a group. They're finding different niches to kind of fill. But so with my new company, I'm really kind of interested in these three threads: community, reality, creativity. But primarily how we make games that are extremely relevant to the player and extremely unique to each individual. Because I think that's the other thing that for me makes games totally unique as a form of media, is that games have the opportunity to be different for every single player. It really is like the most important advantage that we have in games. And I don't see us really kind of grabbing that and going down that path as fully as we could.
And am I able to push you slightly further to being a little bit more specific about how those three aims might be translated into your next project?
Well, I am very interested in basically how we build a game about the player, around the player's life, around the things that they know, places they go, the people they hang out with. Basically, rather than kind of putting the player into some role of a famous general or orc in a D&D world, I'd like to kind of figure out how to bring games back into your normal everyday life, hour to hour, day to day, games that intersect your reality, but give you a very different perspective on it.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd like to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience. And then this is recent. This is in response to a recent article that was published, and you spoke recently about how technology barriers are being overcome when it comes to game design, and the challenges are now psychological barriers. A really fascinating insight. Could you? We didn't get all that much detail. You left it felt like there was more that you wanted to say. Are you able to give us any more information about those thoughts?
Well, as a game designer, really you're dealing with two platforms. You're dealing with the computing platform, which is code and technology and all that stuff, and you're dealing with the human mind. When you design a game, really it's kind of running on both of these platforms at once. A lot of things that we can crunch numbers on in the simulation, we do on the computer, and we present it back to the player with graphics. But a lot of other things that the computer's very not well suited for, we actually run in the player's imagination. For example, in The Sims, when you hear them talk, you don't actually hear what they're saying. You hear this kind of gibberish language. We through a lot of experiments determined that we could actually have them speaking in English or some known language, but they very quickly become robotic and repetitive, and you start realizing the kind of veil of reality disappears. On the other hand, if they spoke gibberish, your mind would naturally kind of fill in the blanks and imagine the conversation. So the Sims have vocal intonation, they have emotion. You can tell they're angry, they're flirting, whatever it is, but you don't hear the exact words. So in essence, what we did is we offloaded that part of the simulation into the human imagination. Now, I think that as a game designer, when I started out my career many decades ago, it was all about, how fast can the computer run? How many, pixels can we put on the screen? We were always kind of fighting the machine at every turn to kind of get more performance out of it, to do more tricks. Those limitations, for the most part, from my point of view, have just fallen by the wayside. I don't feel like I have any really meaningful technological, bottlenecks or barriers ahead of me. So now, at this point, it's really how do we best kind of exploit, the human imagination, the human mind, the human creativity in interesting ways. Really we're trying to kind of get somebody's brain into this certain state that they enjoy. Sometimes it's kind of a flow state, where you're kind of at this border between challenge, accomplishment, difficulty. Other times it's more of a free form of, creative expressive state, or something where you want to share, more of a social state. So I think the human mind, obviously we don't understand that much about it. And as game designers, game design really in some sense is applied psychology. We're kind of hacking human psychology all the way, and we're kind of dealing with these mechanisms in our brains that kind of give us joy, enjoyment. Sometimes it's through challenge, it's through finding patterns, it's through solving, problems, solving puzzles. Our brain is kind of wired to enjoy these things, which really, fundamentally is the process of learning. So our brain is kind of wired to reward us for learning, for pushing our limits, for kind of doing things outside of our barriers. And I think game design really is, in some ways a process of getting us into that state of kind of expanding our mind. So I think, I can sit there and look at the specs of the computer, understand all the stuff it can and can't do. The human mind, though, we have no manual for. So that's really uncharted territory. And as game designers, I think that this is one of the fundamental ways in which we're kind of exploring the human mind.
Wow, that's fantastic. I'm going to just show you the way that we're going to communicate. This is a foam ball that I throw around. It's it's about the size of a basketball. So, and I throw it quite hard. So if you hear a few sort of screams and ouches, then I've hit somebody. So anyway, do we have any questions? I've got plenty if there are none. Oh.
Hi, Will. I was just wondering, which game designers in the world do you most admire? Sort of current or historical?
Oh, that's a good question. Obviously, Miyamoto-san at Nintendo, what I admire most about him is that he always kind of takes the player first. Right off the bat, he looks at the controller, what does it feel like, what's, how tactile and kinesthetic is what he's working on. He kind of works from, inside out. What is the first 5-second player experience? What's the next 10 second? And so his games have this craftsmanship behind them that's just, amazing and unique. Plus the variety of things he's done. So I very much admire him. Also Peter Molyneux. I think Peter Molyneux takes a lot of risks. And, he's got this kind of vicarious thing about, dealing with little worlds full of little people, which, very much matches kind of my sensibilities in a way. Sid Meier, I've always enjoyed his games. His games are just playable. They're just like a comfortable chair you sit in, and it's like I kind of grew up playing board games and these war games and stuff, and Sid did as well. So I think Sid in some ways is kind of recapitulating our youth, the kind of games we would play back then. There are lots more. It's really hard to pick out. These. All three of these are really kind of from my generation of game designer. There are a lot of other ones, up and coming ones doing really weird, cool experimental stuff right now. But I feel like we have a much wider crop of very skilled, talented designers now than we ever have, which is great, for the industry. And partially, as a result of having all these different platforms, and you don't need, the 100-person team. A really smart, bright kid can go out there and get 5 of his friends, and they can put an app, up on the app market, inside of a year. So I think that some of the greatest designers out there, are just getting their start right now.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Hi, Will. What were the biggest influences for the kind of games that you have created? So, the simulations that you've done, which are more than just mechanical, simulate life and that kind of thing. What were your major influences, games and non-games?
Oh, a lot of my influences, for my games come from reading from books. Specific themes, subjects, usually are very kind of targeted, coming from either academic, stuff. I was very inspired, initially by a guy named Jay Forrester, who was kind of the father of modern system dynamics theory back in the 50s. So I was reading about how, he was trying to take different systems, cities, the whole world, factories, and simulate them, basically deconstruct them into component parts that you can kind of build a model of. As a kid, I spent, most of my childhood building models, planes, tanks, and ships, plastic and wood. And, that kind of evolved into building robots. I started putting motors and building tanks and stuff like that, and then got into the idea of robots. And I actually bought my first computer to control my early robots. And, in doing robotics, I started kind of realizing that most of the really hard problems in robotics and AI were really software problems. But, at the same time, I got very interested in kind of not just modeling the world with, static physical models, but how to model the world dynamically, the underlying dynamics of the world and the way things, work. So I'd say that Jay Forrester was a big inspiration kind of down the simulation path. Another inspiration was a Polish writer named Stanislaw Lem, who wrote a lot about little micro worlds, simulated worlds, and kind of the ethics of dealing with these things, a lot of philosophical questions these little worlds bring up. So, and then, for the different games I've done, for almost every game there was like some kind of major inspiration, either, Edward Wilson's work with ants that inspired SimAnt, or Christopher Alexander's work in architecture that inspired The Sims. So I get probably most of my inspiration from reading.
Fair enough, thanks very much.
Hi. DRM has caused a few issues with in SimCity. How has this affected you in the design of your new IP?
Well, I actually, what I'm working on now is going to be much more of a mobile-based experience, and it's, kind of in a totally different ballpark, economically and business-wise, from the old shrink wrap model. I think that, a lot of the old titles, old franchises that are like PC-based and whatnot, are having to evolve very rapidly, in a totally new market, as well as the console, companies and their business models. Their business model used to be that you buy a console, and then they would sell you a bunch of games at $30 a pop, and that really kind of paid for the console development. Now, people are being conditioned, in the app markets, especially, the games are costing, $3 to $5, or they're freemium with microtransactions. So I think that, we're kind of going from one local maxima, in the business landscape in games to a whole another one. And, for a lot of business models, that's going to be a very uncomfortable transition. There's obviously, been a lot of piracy over the years, in the PC market. And so, DRM is kind of like one approach to it. Freemium is another. I think that there's a Darwinian process, that's happening right now before our eyes as to which ones consumers, will accept, which ones they're, really, going to be comfortable with, and how you kind of pull somebody into an experience, and don't front load the kind of economic exposure from the consumer's point of view. So, I think, DRM, and I'm sure this is probably relative to SimCity and what happened with the SimCity launch.
I suspect
but,
so, yes.
Yeah. and I wasn't really working with Electronic Arts at that point, so I can't really say much about that specifically. But I'd say that that kind of DRM issue isn't really so much of a concern for me on the new project I'm working on. But which economic model that we do choose, whether it's microtransactions, subscription, how we monetize it, is a very big unknown, because right now there is no real established model. People are experimenting with all these different things to varying levels of success.
Yeah, and we heard earlier how Facebook is was seen a year ago as being the great nirvana, and EA of course have pulled right back. Now, I'm aware that we haven't actually asked any questions from the upper levels. Is there anybody up there? No, not that I can see. Any more questions? Where's the ball? Could you go? Throw it back, and I'll. Well done.
Yeah, hi Will. That's kind of a follow-up to the last question, actually. I mean, you talked a bit about all of the change that's come over the industry in the last 5 years. I mean, a lot of it is centered on the way the industry is structured, how things are sold. You mentioned in-app purchasing, microtransactions, you've got episodic, and basically it seems to be about the structure of the business, a lot of it. I mean, do you feel that any of that has been a positive for the way games are designed and the way that design has evolved?
I think in some ways, because I think that, as you move to something like a freemium model, what's happening is, and really it's just an expansion of what we used to call game demos, where I could download a demo, and if I liked it, I might go buy the game. We basically granularized that process. But, I am a firm believer that, if the game has value, to the player, if the player really is, enjoying that experience, that the player is willing to kind of then, pay for it in some form. I think that it puts games on, in some sense, a more even footing, in that it's not really so much about, how big of a marketing budget you can put behind it, although that still is a large component. It's not as huge as it used to be. It used to be about things like shelf space and how you get distribution, and there were very limited channels, and I think that was such a huge filter that in some ways was causing the publishers to kind of fall back and be very risk adverse. So, the biggest selling genre was always sequels. Publishers were, comfortable investing millions of dollars into, the second or third version of something they knew was successful. They were much less comfortable with trying something, totally experimental. So I think, in that sense, the new business models that we have are very good for game, development, and that we're seeing much more experimental risk-taking, because you don't necessarily have to, plunk down as much money on marketing and distribution as you did on game development. And the platforms are such that I don't have to spend, tens of millions of dollars to develop, kind of a top-level game on the platform. So I'd say for the most part, it's great. And I think that we're kind of moving to a world where there's a more direct correlation between the value that the player gets from your game and your ability to monetize, from the player. The player can try it out if they spend, and I've been, experienced this myself. There's certain games I play that, kind of I downloaded, they were kind of freemium. I really got into it, and I've been playing months later. And I'm willing at that point to actually, kind of put money into the game, significant amounts of money into the game. And, in some sense, it's up to the game to kind of prove itself to me first, that, do I really want to play this thing again and again and again? Am I really getting into it? At that point, then I'll open my wallet and start kind of, putting money in. And so I think that for the most part it is good, and I think that really the more we can have direct correlation between the value the player gets from a game and the amount of money that we can take from that player, the more people feel good about the industry. Nothing feels worse than dropping down $40 on a game that you buy at a software store, bringing it home, and playing it for half an hour and deciding it sucks. And I think we're kind of moving away from that.
Yeah, I mean, as a quick follow-up, I mean, do you think that your previous games would have benefited from that more open system?
It's hard to say, because I think at the same time, what we've seen is a huge widening of the demographics of the players. And I think that, the reason why some of my games have been fairly successful is the fact that they were actually kind of pulling in a much wider group of people, but, still on a very limited set of platforms, typically PC-based. So I think that, it's hard for me to say. I think that, when you got to like sequels of some of the games I did, The Sims 2, SimCity 2000, etc., at that point, people kind of knew what these things were, and they were much more likely to go, drop the, $30, $40 to buy the game. On the first version, I think it probably did mitigate the spread of these things. It was kind of word of mouth, somebody saying you should check this game out. Maybe you played it at a friend's house, then you would go order it. Right now there's such a kind of an immediacy to being able to try a game. If somebody tells me about a game on my iPhone, I can be playing it in 2 minutes. I don't have to go find it in the store, bring it home, install it. And so that immediacy allows the consumer to experiment with a much wider variety of things. So now kind of the flip side of this is that you have 1,000 cool games competing for your attention, really, and now it's about signal to noise.
Yeah, we were talking earlier actually about the fact that the mix of games really suited the retailers in that they wanted the AAAs, they wanted the fillers, they wanted the budget, and now it sort of is much more geared towards the gamer and what they want, which is one of the reasons why presumably the change has been so profound. Lovely. Can we have the ball slightly over this side, please? Oh, good throw. Oh, that I'm afraid, Will, was the microphone coming out of the foam ball.
Yeah, I guess I have to worry on that. Actually, the question I had in mind is related a bit to what you mentioned earlier. Are there any game genres or any design ideas that you had and you wanted to work on, but you never had the chance, and maybe now that the development cycles are shorter, the risk is smaller, you might have the chance to work on?
Oh, I've had so many ideas, way beyond my, lifespan experiment, and develop them. There were some ideas I had that were kind of interface constrained. There was an idea I actually worked on for many months, which was kind of a tactical storm simulator, very much based in 3D fluid dynamics, and I wanted to be able to go in and actually just kind of grab, the atmosphere and move it, manipulate it in interesting ways. And I think right now with a multi-touch tutorial interface, it's probably much more achievable than it was back with, kind of a mouse and keyboard approach. But oh yeah, there's so many ideas that, at some point in time I kind of got into, and then, for whatever reason, technology, simulation difficulty kind of dropped by the wayside. But for the most part, I think that the thing that's interests me the most is the path that I'm kind of going down, which is, kind of understanding the player, very, very deeply, and kind of designing, having a game that kind of envelops and evolves to fit, particular people.
A couple of years ago, we had Ken Perlin, who came and gave a speech. I gather that you talk to him from time to time. If you had a dream team of people that you put together, who would they be?
Oh, it would depend on the project, and I worked with a number of great, people over the years, and typically, like in programming, it's one of these fields where a great programmer is 100 times more effective than a really good programmer. It's very much a power law distribution, but it also depends entirely on how motivated people are towards the project. That's another huge multiplier. So if you can kind of come up with an idea and figure out, okay, who would really be into this? What area is this that really strikes their fancy? Those are the people you want on the team. So it's kind of hard for me to say that there's one dream team. Ken and his work has been a huge inspiration to me. In fact, he did actually came and was doing a lot of the early consulting for us in Spore, the procedural generation stuff. And so at various times I've had the privilege to work with all these different people, as well as some of the people that I was inspired from their writing, people like Christopher Alexander, James Lovelock. I've gotten them involved in various degrees in the projects, and so to me that really when you get the person who inspired the idea to kind of come in and start giving feedback, whether it's Edward O. Wilson or James Lovelock, to me that is the dream team.
Great. Another question. Great. And the ball. Oh, we've given up on the ball.
So what are the games that you are playing at the moment that you are getting inspired by or you just love?
Well, when I play games, it's interesting. I don't feel like I get inspired by them at all. I just sit and play them. I just enjoy them. There's like, some part of my life where I just kind of put aside the fact that I'm a game designer and that I do this for a living, and I just want to sit and blow things up. My current kind of guilty pleasure is World of Tanks. as you know, a kid, I always loved World War II history, and I built a lot of tank models. And so, you know, World of Tanks has all these different tanks from World War II, and it's actually it's fun for me because it's kind of like a first-person shooter for old people. You don't have fast reflexes to play this game. It's much more about strategic thinking. You know, the tanks go slow, the turrets don't turn fast. When I play first-person shooters, I just get my butt kicked by these, you know, 14-year-old kids. So World of Tanks is kind of like a first-person shooter that you know, an older person like myself can play fairly successfully. I play a lot of apps too on my iPhone and iPad. You know, usually I don't play them kind of very deeply. I'll, you know, try a lot of them just to kind of look at kind of cool things. You know, sometimes it's novel interfaces or just kind of you know, different approaches. Those are probably a little more inspirational to me. But for the most part, you know, what I've really I grew up playing these kind of turn-based strategy games. And so I've always kind of enjoyed those as well. Advance War on the DS, I spent many, many years playing. Sid Meier's Civilization, as well as the new one on the iPad, Civilization Revolutions. So those are the kind of games I spend most of my time playing.
Good. I'm glad you're not the only person who gets their ass kicked at first-person shooters. Lovely. Who next? Anybody want to ask a question? While the microphone's going over, can I just ask, do you think there's a disconnect between the people who design the games and the people who are playing them?
Well, I think a lot of people design games for different reasons. You know, if you talk to different game designers, it kind of depends on, you know, where they are, what kind of company they're in, if they're in a startup situation. You know, some just want, you know, to build a successful company, and they don't really care what kind of game they make. Is, you know, they try to figure out what the, you know, hot genre is. You know, other people are much more into kind of artistic expression. You know, these are more like the indie game developers, and they want to push forward the state of the art, you know, kind of in game design, and try new, interesting, weird things. You know, try to strike out and discover new genres. Some people, you know, they're very kind of wedded to a genre. You know, I want to do the coolest first-person shooter set in World War II that's been done so far. You know, and that's very much more of a craftsmanship approach. So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, as a player, you just want to kind of sit back and have a good time, enjoy whatever it is. But I think that Sid Meier actually said once that sometimes game designers, you know, design games for players. Other times they design games for themselves. And, you know, I think I've been guilty of that, you know, a couple of times. And learned from that as I stepped back and kind of, you know, like Sim Earth, which was a game I did many years ago. I got really into the simulation, and I spent all this time, you know, getting the climate connected to the geology. And from the player's point of view, they didn't really see underneath the hood. They didn't see, you know, all these kind of bits and pieces moving around and how beautifully, you know, it worked like this, you know, wonderful clockwork. You know, for them, what they saw were all these graphs and things that were, you know, from the player's point of view, I think playing Sim Earth was kind of like being put into a cockpit of a 747, you know, in a nosedive with all the gauges spinning. They're pushing the controls around, trying to kind of come up with some association between their input and the output. You know, the simulation was basically too complex, I think, for players to really kind of enjoy and learn. As a designer, I got, you know, totally into the simulation and forgot the player. So that was something I learned very much from. So yeah, I mean, that does happen a lot. But, you know, right now, I think that the markets are so immediate and so Darwinian that, you know, also the metrics that we're collecting from players, we're able to, you know, discover, you know, in a few hours, kind of where players are getting stuck, you know, what they're enjoying, the things that, you know, are surprising us about their activities in the game. And so I think that we're able, you know, to learn from the players through a much quicker, tighter iteration loop than we ever were before.
Do you engage directly with your audience? Do people contact you and ask you questions, and do you tend to reply, or would you just get overwhelmed?
As much as possible. I mean, you know, one of the most important roles, I think, you know, for any game being released today is basically community management. You know, understanding, listening to the players, getting a sense of what the consensus is from the players, and responding back to them. You know, part of that is just kind of, you know, care and feeding of the community. If they understand that you're listening, all of a sudden you can really kind of spin it from, you know, your community going bad and turning into a flame war to them being on your side and becoming kind of your evangelists. But another big part of that is really kind of understanding what are they enjoying about your game, or what are the things about your game that are the most frustrating to them, and then how quickly can you respond to that and fix it? Because as soon as you can start that conversation with your community, then you're kind of working with them. They're helping you develop the game, and you're hill climbing. And I think that, you know, we have the technology, we have the metrics, we have the communications to do that now, very effectively and very rapidly.
Lovely, thank you. Let's have another question.
Hi, Will. You mentioned earlier player states, so different states that the player can be in. Are there any particular player states that you would like to explore more? And if you did that, would that lead to new game ideas, possibly?
By player states, I mean like psychological states.
Yes.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that, games in some sense, they started almost from, the core brain, like the reptilian brain. Early games were about, aggression, defense, survival, and so they kind of have the reptilian brain that games were initially kind of preying on, because it was easy and effective. Games, are starting to kind of get to the outer layers of our brain and to a wider palette of emotions, which kind of brings the player into different states. So, there are a lot of games out there right now that are very kind of reflective or meditative, very relaxing, which is kind of the opposite of the early games where we're all about adrenaline. So I think that, games have been kind of more external to the player. In other words, it's about the player being set in some world and dealing with things around them. And I think that, one of the areas that we haven't really explored much that I'm very interested in is how we get players to kind of get more of a sense of their internal states, their own psychology. What is it like to be inside their head, inside their mind? And I think games, can kind of extract a lot of that from the individual players, and allow players to kind of see interesting reflections of themselves in the game, not just some external virtual reality or fictitious world, as a playfield. So I think that it's these kind of self-reflective games that, to me, kind of imply a certain mental state of self-awareness that I think that we have not explored at all, really, in games.
Do you feel that narrative can get in the way of that experience? A strong narrative in a game?
Well, I think that there's always going to be this kind of tension between narrative and freedom in the game, or agency. I can sit there and tell you a story, and it's a very passive experience. I can kind of put you in a game, and really the chief strength of a game, the thing that almost defines a game, or any kind of play experience, is the fact that you're driving it. It is interactive, and you get to steer the situation. So if I'm telling you a story, that really is totally at odds with you steering the situation. And I think that there's this tension between the two. And the most effective stories I've ever heard from gaming are the unique stories that players have told me about things that they did in the game that nobody else did. So I think of games more as a platform for the players to kind of play out stories than as a medium for the game designer to kind of tell a story. Because, to me, telling a story is, almost right off the bat putting the player in a passive role. So, I think that as a game designer, I think it's much more interesting to get on the path of how do we teach our games to recognize the story that the player is trying to play out and then respond and support that story. I think, the game itself can, become something of a director, in the background, watching the player actually kind of drive the story forward and then try to support and amplify that dramatically.
Did you get to play Journey, which won lots of awards both in the UK and obviously in the US?
Oh, the Journey from way back, many, many years ago.
No, from last year, from
that
game company.
There was an old game called Journey as well.
Right, let's have another question. Sorry, the only reason I mentioned that was that gets a very interesting balance between the narrative, which they tell you very little about and you discover yourself, but then this real sense of emotion in the character themselves.
Yeah, I think Braid, captured that as well. So I'm not saying that there aren't ways to do that. It is a very tricky thing, though.
Lovely. Another question?
Hi. On our site, we see a lot of readers arguing amongst themselves, like on and on, day in, day out. It's really annoying. About the danger of next-gen consoles delivering more advanced visuals, but sort of forgetting the gameplay aspect and just sort of giving us more flash and just more of what we see today, but looking better. As a game developer who has come up with some very innovative gameplay mechanics that have been copied by other studios many times over the years, do you feel this is a valid concern?
Yeah, I think that we've had historically in the games industry this kind of arms race graphics, pixels, polygons. And in some sense, if I look back to the games I was playing 20, 30 years ago, where there were just a few little pixels on the screen and that was a character. But yet somehow I cared about that character, and I was able to infuse that character with life. If I look at kind of what we can do with modern day equipment, we can build these beautiful looking, rendered humans, creatures, agents, but their behavioral range is still, about that of an ant. I think that we've gone way, way ahead on the graphics side, but on the kind of simulation behavioral side, we're still, many steps back. And also at the same time, I see that, people playing these games in the app market, that really are games that, we could have done, 20 years ago, but still they're fun. People, get engaged and they spend time playing with them. So I think that, you can go down this path of, hyper-realistic graphics, and it is kind of impressive and nice to look at, for a while. But at the end of the day, it's gameplay that's going to keep me playing the game for, 20, 30, 40 hours. So, it's unfortunate also in that as we get on that path, it makes development so much more expensive. That's where you do need, millions of dollars to really kind of put something out in the market that's, on par with all the other stuff. So, I think that world will continue to exist. I think it's going to become kind of a smaller and smaller chunk of the overall games market. So, I'm not sure that it's even all that relevant, to the games industry as a whole. I mean, I think it is kind of cool that we have these, advanced graphic processors and could have these hyper-realistic things. But like you say, at the end of the day, it's gameplay, that we're really kind of, that's the broad landscape. There's one path to kind of making things more hyper-realistic. Who knows how many different types of kind of new, innovative gameplay genres there are out there that we haven't yet discovered. And so I think that's really the frontier.
And going on from that, do you have any thoughts on the new generation of consoles that are coming through and the different approaches between Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo?
Well, I think, there's kind of, gameplay, which is one thing, but a lot of these people are also competing to become your media hub. That's really kind of the battle that they're starting to fight. And, gameplay is kind of interesting because it's becoming more ubiquitous and it's starting to infuse our culture everywhere, this whole gamification movement. And so I think, people are seeing gameplay, kind of send tendrils out into the other forms of media. The way I browse media, the way I think about music or movies or social networks. I think games are, in some sense, potentially could become some of the connective tissue between these things. And as you look at this next generation of consoles, I think they're kind of seeing that as like, you kind of buy this as a game machine, but really it's going to become your media hub. And, from a consumer's point of view, I think gaming, there's not a huge distinction, I think, between gaming and watching YouTube and listening to my music. I mean, they're all just kind of different forms of entertainment that I'm kind of enjoying digitally. And so I think that's probably the biggest role of these new consoles going forward. I think that, again, with these other platforms, whether they're social platforms or mobile platforms, I think that we're going to see those as maybe the larger frontier on new innovative game development, as well as reaching a kind of a wider, broader audience. Because I think mainstream USA, they had been in this cycle of buying a console every 4 years and upgrading their Xbox. I think that nowadays they're spending more time on their iPads or tablets and things like that.
Great. We have a question here, Charlie.
Thanks, hi. There's lots of novel interface mechanisms being delivered, Kinect, Google Glass, Oculus Rift, and so on. Do you think the multi-touch touch screen is going to wipe them all out, or do you see that innovation flowering?
Well, there are so many different, kind of input devices that are kind of appearing right now, which is kind of nice because for the longest time, we basically had all this increase in output from the computer, higher resolution, better sound, whereas the input was pretty much the same little straw, mouse, keyboard, maybe a joypad. So, seeing things like multi-touch gestorial interfaces, 3D, Z-buffer, Kinects type things, are opening interesting areas kind of in game development. I think that, one of the more interesting ones is going to be kind of the eyewear side of things, where that goes, Google Glass and whatnot. I think that that's going to be something that feels fundamentally different. That's going to be a whole new kind of thing to explore, and it's going to have a lot of kind of social stigma attached to it, which will be interesting, and kind of fun to explore. But I think that again, even with the input we have, whether it's multi-touch gesture or just mouse and keyboard, I think that the hard part really is kind of getting into the psychology of the player. And I don't see that the interfaces are that big of a bottleneck towards that. I can imagine designing kind of an interesting, effective game around almost any interface, and each one has its strengths. And certain ones, it's really hard to do a dance game with a keyboard and mouse, whereas a Kinect, dance game works pretty well. So certain ones will become basically, kind of the homes for certain genres. But I don't see, any one size fits all. I see, a sea of diversification.
And Oculus Rift in specific has obviously got a lot of interest because virtual reality was the big thing in the 80s and then never quite worked out, and it's come back again. Do you see new genres being created specifically for this much more integral control method?
I think the augmented reality thing, has a lot of potential kind of going forward. There's still kind of, the pragmatic aspect of, how long can I wear these things in my head, without getting motion sick. And so there's some very practical concerns about these things. But I think the idea of kind of blending gaming with reality is very intriguing to me. And it's actually more intriguing than the idea of, pure virtual reality, where I put on the headset and the whole world disappears. And I think it's probably more pragmatic as well, to have some awareness of what's around you. So I think, if I had to kind of pick one technology that I think, is going to be maybe a leap forward for gaming, it probably would be, down the augmented reality path.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Right, can we have... Oh, sorry, Simon, you've already got one. Beg your pardon, you've got the microphone.
Hi, Will. I have a question about business models. As a lot of games and game genres migrate from premium business models to free-to-try, how do you see that both reflected in business models and in the role of the designer, and the way that you would design for a free-to-try game?
Well, in some sense, it puts the psychology of the designer kind of back to where we were in the old arcade machine days. Basically, how do you get somebody, in the first couple minutes, really enjoying the activity enough to where they can't stop, like giving them a bag of potato chips. And it's a very Pavlovian thing. Really, you kind of have to unveil the value in the game kind of progressively and get the player kind of emotionally hooked, because once you get them emotionally hooked, it's a lot easier to get them to pull $1 out of their pocket than the promise of this is going to be really cool if you can open the red door. So I think in some ways it kind of front loads a lot of the designer's task, in that right off the bat, if I can't get the player kind of past a certain point in this game, any other effort I put into that game is wasted. And so I'm going to spend a lot more time thinking about that initial user experience, which isn't necessarily bad. I think that then once you kind of pull somebody into that experience, it's about how do you keep them there? What's the stickiness? And for one of the most I think effective ways that we found over the years is really around community and social interaction. As soon as I'm interacting with other people and I have some reputation and I have a role and I see myself and this is part of my identity, that's as sticky as anything. So I think that it is going to bring games into a somewhat more social space, because I think social is one of those kind of thumbnail, here's how we make the experience sticky. On the business side, I think that you're going to see a lot of people, kind of trying things to some degree, where you're putting something out with a certain amount of development, and you're waiting to see if people kind of get pulled into it before you actually invest that much on the backside of development. So I think that we're going to see games, not necessarily unveiled episodically, but I can definitely see games kind of growing while they're in the market. I come out with kind of my first version, and if people really get into it, then I kind of add more and more layers to it. And we're seeing a lot of that happen. So it's kind of staged development where you're reinvesting based upon success.
Lovely, thank you. Look, we're almost out of time, and I know that it's quite early over there, so we're very grateful to you for getting up and making a cup of coffee and being prepared to talk to us. I'd like to just ask one final question. At the beginning, you talked about young game designers out there, and that was probably where a lot of new ideas were going to come from. You have inspired a lot of people through many years. What do you say to people when they ask how they should get into the industry?
Well, I think, no matter what you're doing, you have to kind of follow your passions if you're going to do it well. So usually when I talk to somebody about the industry, I try to get a sense of, what is it that really gets them excited? Is it creating worlds? Is it inspiring players? Is it, more on the kind of engineering side, more on the, psychological side? But then, I find that, too many people in the gaming industry are a little myopic in that they try to get most of their inspiration from the gaming industry. And I found so much more interesting stuff kind of outside the gaming industry, especially other design fields. And so usually somebody who's kind of going down the path of game design, I really kind of encourage them to look at all these other fields of design. And it could be something like furniture, automotive design, Japanese gardening, whatever. Some of these design fields have been around for centuries. And there's a huge amount of kind of knowledge and inspiration to kind of be pulled out of these other fields. So, typically that's kind of the advice I would give to somebody coming into the industry.
Fantastic. Well, I have a red screen flashing at me saying that we've gone over and I get scolded. So can I take the opportunity to thank you so much for joining us, and can we have a round of applause? Thank you very much.